Hello and welcome to the video on the distributive property. I thought I'd throw up this video because it seemed like some people were having trouble with the concept of the distributive property, or maybe they forgot over the weekend. But this is meant to be a supplement to the lesson that we had on the distributive property on Friday and as well as today. And so if you're a little unclear about what the distributive property is or how it works, this video is the video for you. So without further ado, let's get started. Well, I'm going to start by using an example from the book, and I think I actually assigned it as homework. From page 48, we're going to take a look at problem number 15, which should look something like this. Now, what the distributive property tells us is that when we have a problem like this, and we're asked to simplify this expression, and again, this is an expression, not an equation, because we don't have an equal sign, and so it's not an equation. We're not setting it equal to anything. But when we have this expression, when we have a coefficient in front of this these grouped addends here, what we're essentially going to do is we're going to take this 7 and distribute it to both the t as well as the 4. And when we do that, when we distribute the 7, what we're essentially doing is we're going to take 7t, or 7 times that t, and then we're going to subtract from it 7 times the 4. Okay? And so what we essentially end up with is when we multiply a coefficient with a variable, we just end up with 7t, because we don't know what the value of t is yet, and so we leave it as 7t, and then we're going to subtract from that 7 times 4, which is 28. And so the simplified expression, when we start off this way, the simplified expression that we end up with as an answer is 7t minus 28. Now, the concept behind the distributive property is fairly straightforward. Let me go ahead and erase this. Let's think about the distributive property in terms of something a little bit more visual. What if we went ahead and drew something like, we did this in class, but we have 5 apples. And we have 5 apples, and we have a box of these 5 apples. Let me go ahead and draw a box around it. But we have this box of 5 apples. Excuse the terrible box that I'm drawing here. And again, let me put in parentheses the number of apples that we have. But along with the 5 apples, what I also have is 3 lemons. And if I have a box of 5 apples and 3 lemons, let's say I have more than one box of this very same combination. Let's say I have, let's say I have 3. Okay? So if I have 3 boxes of this combination of fruits, how can I figure out how many apples I have total and how many lemons I have total? Well, what I'm essentially going to be doing, and this is going to look very similar to what I was doing before, but essentially what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be taking this 3, which is the number of boxes I have with this very combination, and I'm going to be multiplying it to those numbers inside in order for us to be able to figure out how many total apples I have and how many total lemons I have. And so, of course, if we go ahead and multiply that, what we should end up with is 3 times 5 is 15. And of course, 3 times 3 is 9. And so I'm going to use the same close we were using before. We should have 15 apples. And we should have 9 lemons. So if that doesn't make sense to you, you can go ahead and try drawing another 2 boxes of apples and count up how many apples you have and how many lemons you have. But I think you'll see, I'm sure that you'll see actually that you will end up with 15 apples and 9 lemons, because we're taking those things inside and multiplying it by 3. And that's essentially the whole idea behind the distributive property. Now let's apply those ideas to more complex numbers that, especially from the homework, that people might be having trouble with. Let's go ahead and take a look at a problem like problem number 21 from the homework. So problem number 21 from the homework looks like this. Now, when we go ahead and we try multiplying, we're going to distribute the 0.25 to both the 6q and the 32. You're going to see that the numbers are not going to be pretty, but it doesn't mean that that we can't get the right answer. So don't be put off by what you see here. Just because it's a little bit more complex doesn't mean that we can't overcome this, but because the principles are essentially the same. What we're going to do is we're going to take this 0.25 and we're going to distribute it to the 6q, and then we're also going to distribute that to the 32. And again, when we're distributing this to a number or to a coefficient with a variable, all we're doing is we're going to be multiplying the numbers together and leaving the variable alone, because the variable, we don't know the value of it, and so we can just leave it alone. And so what we should end up with essentially is 0.25 times 6q plus the second part. We're going to keep the plus because it's the same sign, and so we're going to take 0.25 times 32. Make that 2 a little clearer there. So what is going to happen is we're going to multiply 0.25 and 6, and for the sake of time, I'm just pulling up my calculator and doing it real quick. 0.25 times 6 is actually 1.5 q, and 0.25 times 32 is 8. And if you don't believe me, pull out your calculator and try that out. But this is the finished problem. We have 1.5 q, the variable, and we can't do anything to it because it's just a variable. We don't know the value of q yet. We're not given the value of q for this problem. And we have simplified the right addend, and so what we're left with is 1.5 q plus 8, and that is actually our answer. If you were expecting more, I'm sorry to disappoint. That's essentially what it is. So let's go ahead and get on to the next problem. Let's take a look at a problem like problem number 23. Let me drag it up here from the bottom. I had it prepared. And so when we have a problem like problem number 23, when we're asked to do essentially the same thing, this time we don't have a decimal. This time we have a variable, 5 over 16. And this one's a little bit different as well because it looks like the coefficient is occurring after the grouping symbol. Before it was occurring before, but it's after. But here it still remains the same. And if anybody was wondering why it remains the same, it's because of one of the properties we talked about today. The commutative property of multiplication tells us it doesn't matter which order we multiply in. This 5 over 16 can be in the front, it can be in the back, but it doesn't matter because it can be multiplied in either direction. And so when we take 5 over 16 and we apply the distributive property to it because we're multiplying with something inside grouping symbols, this 5 over 16 still has to get distributed to all of the terms inside the grouping symbol. And so 5 over 16 times 8 is what we have for the first part, 5 over 16 times 8. And then we're going to keep the same sign here. And then we're going to take this 5 over 16 and multiply it by 3r. 3r. Okay? And so what we essentially are going to have is this expression here. And then we're just going to go ahead and multiply this out. 5 times 8. Again, if I can think of this in terms of fractions, if I could turn this into a fraction, it'd be 8 over 1. Same for 3r, it'd be 3r over 1. And we just multiply the numerators and the numerators and the denominators with the denominators. And so 5 times 8 is 40. And 16 times 1 is 16. And we're going to subtract from that this right addend, and that's going to be 5 times 3r. Again, the 5 and the 3 are the only things that get multiplied because we don't know what the variable is. But we have 5 of those 3r's, and so we're going to essentially have 15r. And in the denominator, we have 16 times 1, which is 16. And from here, we're still not done simplifying because we can go ahead and take this 40 over 16, and I believe we can go ahead and from here we can simplify it further by dividing the numerator and the denominator by 8. I think this one's pretty much done, but let's go ahead and simplify this first addend. 40 divided by 8 is 5. 16 divided by 8 is 2 minus 15r over 16 And I think we've simplified it as far as we can go. I mean, we can make that an improper fraction, but I don't care. This is just fine as it is. And this would be the acceptable answer for number 23. So the concepts are essentially the same. I don't want to do all of your homework for you, but go ahead and check those answers with what you have. See if you understand the concept, and we'll cover it again on another day, probably tomorrow. But if you're watching this from the future, then go ahead and rewind and watch this as many times as you need to if you still don't understand.